Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to outline one of the most influential theories in contemporary metaphysics, David Lewis's Humean supervenience. So first of all, Humean supervenience is part of a broader project of defending physicalism or materialism, the thesis that everything is physical. Physicalism in one form or another is a popular view in contemporary philosophy, and Humean supervenience is one way of carrying out the physicalist project. So the idea is this. According to Humean supervenience, ultimately all that there is in the world is what Lewis calls the Humean Mosaic. And as he puts it, this is the doctrine that all there is to the world is a vast mosaic of local matters of particular fact, just one little thing and then another. So essentially this consists of three claims. First of all, the world consists of a set of space-time points and intrinsic properties instantiated at each space-time point. For instance, mass or charge. To say that a property of a space-time point is intrinsic is to say that the property does not depend on the properties of any other space-time point. So we can characterize the intrinsic properties of a space-time point without reference to any other space-time points. Right, so you can think of, like, I don't know, a fundamental particle, and then you can just characterize the properties of that particle without referring to any other particles or to anything else that there is. So as Lewis puts it, I quote, "The fundamental properties are local qualities, perfectly natural intrinsic properties of points or of point-sized occupants of points." And importantly, these properties can be recombined freely. The instantiation of some property P at a space-time point S does not force any particular property at any neighbouring space-time points. Or to put it a little more intuitively, the fact that, say, some fundamental particle has a particular charge, that does not necessitate that a different fundamental particle has any particular charge. Okay, so second, the only fundamental relational properties are spatiotemporal relations. Lewis says, "The fundamental relations are exactly the spatiotemporal relations, distance relations, both space-like and time-like, and perhaps also occupancy relations between point-sized things and space-time points." So the only fundamental relational properties will be properties like being one point to the left of, or being located within this particular point. So you might say that, like, a particular particle is located within this point, or you might say that this particle is to the left of this particle. So those are the fundamental relations. So basically, there is nothing to the world beyond the intrinsic properties of the fundamental particles plus their spatiotemporal relations. That is the Humean mosaic, and everything else that there is, everything else that exists, supervenes on the Humean mosaic. So, in general, we say that X properties supervene on Y properties just in case there can be no change in X properties without a change in Y properties. So Humean supervenience says all properties supervene on the intrinsic properties of space-time points and their spatiotemporal relations. There can be no change in any property in the world without a change in the properties of space-time points and their spatiotemporal relations. A helpful way to think about this is to draw an analogy with, like, a digital display composed of pixels. Let's say that each pixel emits either red or green or blue light. The colour of a pixel is an intrinsic property of that pixel, in that we can characterise the colour of a pixel without reference to any other pixels. I mean, like, if you just take a pixel in itself, the pixel is what it is independently of what any other pixels are doing. Regardless of what colours the other pixels are, this pixel can have any colour at all. So, like, if some pixel is red, the pixel next to it may be either green or blue or red. It can be anything, right? The redness of any particular pixel does not force any other pixel to be any particular colour. Now, coloured pixels arranged in a particular way can be used to create larger patterns. So we have here an image of Frank Zappa, and every property of this image is fixed by the arrangement of the colours of the pixels. So, we can say, okay, this is an image of Frank Zappa, this part is his moustache, this part is his nose, here's his hair. Well, the shape of Zappa's moustache supervenes on the arrangement of the pixel colours. In order to change, any difference in the shape of Zappa's moustache would require a difference in the arrangement of colours of the pixels. According to Humean supervenience, this is basically how the world is. This is what the world as a whole is like. The final part of this picture is anti-hexaetism. So according to hexaetism, the world could differ non-qualitatively without differing qualitatively. Now, to get a handle on this, consider another world which has exactly the same qualitative properties as our world. So there's no difference in terms of mass, charge, size, shape, and so on. It's like, imagine a world that's, it's like a mirror of our world. Even so, in this world, I do not exist. Now, there is still a person in this world who has the name Kane Baker and who is running a YouTube channel that does philosophy and who did a philosophy PhD and all of this stuff, right? Because again, this world is qualitatively identical to our world. But that person is not me. This is somebody who has exactly the same properties as me, but they're distinct from me. So the question is this possible? The hexaetist would say yes, that it is. Or consider a world in which, again, it's exactly qualitatively identical to our world, but people sort of swap their roles. So imagine, for instance, that Frank Zappa plays the Donald Trump role and vice versa. So in this world, it's Frank Zappa who was named Donald Trump and who became US president from 2017 to 2021. In this world, it's Donald Trump who was named Frank Zappa, who was born in Baltimore in 1940, who wrote the album Joe's Garage. Is this possible? Well, again, the hexaetist would say yes. So hexaetism assumes that there are sort of kind of bare identity facts, like each entity has some unique identity that makes it different from every other entity, where this is not dependent on any of its qualitative properties. Anti-hexaetists deny this. And Lewis was an anti-hexaetist. Humean supervenience denies hexaetism. All facts there are supervene on the distribution of qualitative properties. So a qualitatively identical world just is an identical world, period. And a world that's qualitatively identical to this world, I exist. If I exist in this world, then I must exist in a qualitatively identical world, because ultimately I am just, a particular arrangement of, intrinsic properties in the Humean Mosaic. That's all I am. So that's Humean supervenience. It is worth noting that, as Lewis sees it, Humean supervenience is not necessarily true. There are possible worlds in which Humean supervenience fails, in which there's more than the Humean Mosaic. I mean, maybe that's the case for the actual world, but as it happens, Lewis thinks not. If we can bet on physicalism, we can bet on Humean supervenience. But we might have discovered that there were genuinely fundamental properties at a macroscopic scale, that there were irreducible properties, irreducible vital forces in biology, or maybe ghosts or spirits or demons made of completely different stuff. It's just, that's possible, but that's not how the world actually is. So while there are possible worlds in which such things exist, our world is not among them. Okay, so that's the Humean Mosaic. Now, despite the name the Humean Mosaic, it's important to note that this is not the view of David Hume. Obviously, it takes its name from David Hume. This is not the view of David Hume. For one thing, Hume was not a physicalist. So what makes this Humean is the denial that there are any fundamental modal properties, or that there are any irreducible modal properties. Hume famously attacked the notion of necessary connections between distinct things. So, in his arguments concerning causality, for instance, when one billiard ball moves and strikes another billiard ball, we'd say that the first billiard ball has caused the second billiard ball to move. For Hume, the sort of standard way of thinking about causality is that it assumes that there's a sort of necessary connection. There's some kind of causal glue that ties the first event to the second event, that ties like the motion of that first billiard ball to the motion of the second billiard ball. There's a necessary connection between these two events. And of course Hume denies this, right? He attacks this idea of necessary connection. So you can check out my videos on causality and laws of nature for more on this. I'll put links to that in the description. So the key point for Lewis is that laws, causes, powers, dispositions, probabilities, all of that stuff, all of that must be reduced to the local particular matters of fact within the Humean mosaic. And the Humean mosaic in itself is amodal. There is no modality at the fundamental level, as it were. So one way to think about this, I mean, just to elaborate this a little bit more, there's a debate in the literature on laws of nature between Humean and necessitarian approaches. For the Humean, laws of nature are basically just regularities in the world. They're special kinds of regularities. So if we think of this in terms of the Humean mosaic, we would say, well, there are these local particular matters of fact, and then we can identify regularities and patterns in these local facts. For instance, we can say, you know, no object accelerates beyond the speed of light, and then that can be just cashed out in terms of some regularity within the Humean mosaic. And then that's all, you know, that's basically what the law of nature is. It's just some regularity that we found. By contrast, for the necessitarian, laws of nature are more like, you know, they're like independent principles that govern the events and processes going on in the world. So it's not just that nothing accelerates beyond the speed of light. Of course, it's true that nothing accelerates beyond the speed of light, but it's not just that nothing accelerates beyond the speed of light. It's that there is a law which necessitates that nothing accelerates beyond the speed of light. Nothing can accelerate beyond the speed of light. So, on this view, there is, in addition to the Humean mosaic, there are going to be laws which govern the behavior of that mosaic. So those laws can't be reduced to the Humean mosaic because they govern it. So in a sense, they sort of stand outside it, and they make the Humean mosaic behave in the way that it does. And you know, Lewis is going to reject this, right? He's just saying no, right? Like ultimately, laws have to be reduced to the just local particular matters of fact in the Humean mosaic. The idea that there are these kind of laws of nature which govern the Humean mosaic, that's unacceptable. Now there is actually a lot more to say about Lewis's approach to laws, and I hope to cover that in another video shortly. But that should hopefully give you a flavour of the view here. That should, I mean, this is the point, right? Like ultimately we're saying there is nothing outside this just, you know, collection of space-time points and intrinsic properties of space-time points, right? That's it. And this collection of space-time points is not being like governed by laws or anything like that. Okay. Or at least maybe we can say that it's governed by laws, but not, you know, like those laws are going to be just reducible to the specific matters of fact concerning the set of space-time points. Okay, so the Humean mosaic is a metaphysical model of the world, and it sets the sort of, I mean, it sets the task for much of the rest of Lewis's philosophy. The challenge is going to be to show how various phenomena reduce to the Humean mosaic. This is sometimes called the location problem. So for anything that we think exists, the question is, where is it? Where is it located in the Humean mosaic? Now, for some objects, this task is relatively straightforward. Consider ordinary objects like chairs and tables. So we locate ordinary objects in our ontology by identifying them with the sums of fundamental particles in the Humean mosaic. Lewis endorses unrestricted composition, the view that any two objects whatsoever compose a further object. So if you have two atoms, those two atoms compose a further object that has the two atoms as parts, regardless of the relation between those two atoms. So any set of fundamental particles at all will compose a further object. So, you know, like, okay, I take a table, well, that's just a collection of particles, and, you know, as long as you have a collection of particles that are arranged in the right way, you're going to have a table. Because there are no conditions on composition at all, really. As long as you have two things, then you have a further thing that is composed of those two things. So, of course, this means that in addition to all of the ordinary objects of common sense, in addition to things like tables and chairs, there are going to be a variety of rather unusual objects. There's going to be scattered objects. There's the object which consists of my hand plus the Pacific Ocean, or there's the object that consists of my hand plus the Pacific Ocean plus an electron that currently resides in the most distant galaxy in the universe, or something like that, right? So yes, I mean, any two things compose a further thing. So in that way, we can locate ordinary objects within the Humean mosaic, right? You just have to have um, collections of particles arranged in a table-like way, and then you've got a table. Or then, arranged in a chair-like way, then you've got a chair. So it should be fairly clear how ordinary objects find their place within the Humean mosaic. So of course, this is a kind of reductionism. It's strictly a metaphysical reductionism. So we would say that, a chair, for instance, is ultimately just a complex arrangement of fundamental particles. And in principle, we can say everything that there is to say about chairs by describing the fundamental particles. In practice, this is of course impossible. Translating even a simple sentence such as Frank is sitting on the chair, translating even that into the language of fundamental physics will never be within our grasp. So there are good practical reasons to continue talking about chairs. And crucially, we can do this without doublethink, as it were, because, well, chairs really do exist. It's not that we're talking. When I say something like Frank is sitting on a chair, I can say that, and it can be true, and I can believe that it's true, and I can, and chairs really exist, right? There's no fiddling around to avoid commitment to unpleasant consequences, right? Like, no, chairs really do exist. By locating how chairs reduce to the Humean mosaic, we don't eliminate chairs, we show how it is that they exist. It's just that what makes claims about chairs true or false is the arrangement of the Humean mosaic. Our common sense beliefs are true in virtue of the arrangement of the Humean mosaic. Now, obviously, carrying out this Humean program is a large task because for a very broad range of things, it's going to be controversial whether those things can be located within the Humean mosaic. So for any property P, we might have one of three reactions. First, we might claim that P can be reduced to the Humean mosaic, and so there we go, we have a reductionist account of P. Second, we might claim that P cannot be reduced to the Humean mosaic, and so nothing is P, right? There just are no things that are P. And third, we might claim that P cannot be reduced to the Humean mosaic, but that there are P's, there are things that are P, so there must be more to the world than there is in the Humean mosaic. Obviously, Lewis can't endorse the third option for anything. Now, generally, when it comes to the first and the second option, well, either of those in principle would be fine. As it happens, Lewis is generally going to favour the first option. Where possible, he wants to preserve the entities and properties that are postulated in common sense and in scientific inquiry. So he wants to say, look, there are minds, there are laws, there is causality, there are moral values, and so on. And these things are all reducible to the Humean mosaic. Yeah, I mean, really the central challenge to the Humean mosaic comes from the third option, right? There are a number of objections to Humean supervenience which allege that, there is some property P, that P is instantiated, but that P cannot be reduced to the Humean mosaic. Think of the standard objections to physicalism in philosophy of mind, right? If it turns out that consciousness is not a physical property, well, Humean supervenience fails. Or, as noted earlier, if it turns out that laws of nature involve necessary connections that govern the mosaic, then Humean supervenience fails. Or if it turns out that moral properties are non-natural properties, Humean supervenience fails, and so on. And of course, there are many philosophers who defend these sorts of claims. Okay then, quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon, and I upload bonus videos on Patreon, so you can hear more of what I have to say. A lot of the videos on Patreon are more they're a bit more personal. It's sort of me expressing just my own views about things. Or you can send me just a one-off donation on PayPal, and any money that you can send, it's really appreciated. The channel takes a lot of work, so it helps. So it really helps if you can send some money my way to help support it. I also offer private tutoring in philosophy. I've done a degree, a master's and a PhD in philosophy, so that's my background. Send me an email if you're interested in setting that up. And I have a Discord. So the links to all of this will be in the description. Okay, let's get back to Humean supervenience. So let's just say then that the reduction of these things to the Humean mosaic can successfully be carried out? Well, there are other challenges to Humean supervenience, and in particular, I mean, I suppose really the central challenge is that Humean supervenience appears to just be false. That despite its claim to being a type of physicalism, physics indicates that it's false. And there are actually several respects in which the Humean mosaic potentially conflicts with modern physics. For example, it seems that quantum entanglement violates the condition that the property of any given space-time point is completely independent of the property of any other space-time point. So when particles are entangled, properties like spin and momentum are perfectly correlated, even when the particles are separated by a large distance. And in an entangled system, the quantum state of the whole is not simply an aggregate of the quantum states of its parts. Rather, the quantum state of the whole it's kind of like it seems like a genuinely emergent property. And quantum entanglement is now it's a pretty well established phenomenon. There may of course be clever interpretations of quantum mechanics that can make entanglement compatible with the Humean mosaic, but it seems at least that there is some evidence from physics that the Humean mosaic is false. Or consider more recent theories that postulate that space-time itself is emergent from some deeper properties. Maybe on the fundamental level there just is no space or time, and space-time emerges from something completely different. In that case, the idea that everything reduces to space-time points is obviously false. Now, regardless of what we say about these ideas, it looks like surely we should be open to them. I mean, it would be absurd for philosophers to insist that the Humean mosaic is the right theory, even if evidence from physics conflicts with it. I mean, especially if you're claiming to be a physicalist. So this is often seen as a big problem. Now, in fact, Lewis himself actually just grants that Humean supervenience probably isn't true. It, strictly speaking, is probably false. There is, probably more to the world than local particular matters of fact, and contemporary physics does provide evidence for this. So, for Lewis, though, this is kind of beside the point. He thinks it doesn't really matter whether Humean supervenience is strictly speaking true. And so what's going on here? Well, here's what Lewis says. He says, the point of defending Humean supervenience is not to support reactionary physics, but rather to resist philosophical arguments that there are more things in heaven and earth than physics has dreamt of. Therefore, if I defend the philosophical tenability of Humean supervenience, that defence can doubtless be adapted to whatever better supervenience thesis may emerge from better physics. All right, what's going on here? Well, I mean, okay, so remember that according to physicalists, everything is physical. Okay, whatever there is in the world must be, grounded in or must arise from whatever is postulated by our best physical theory. But, look, nobody thinks that physics is complete. We don't have the final picture yet. We don't know what the final story will be. And so that does, to some degree, leave physicalists in a tricky position. They need to show that consciousness, for instance, is a physical property, but they don't yet have a clear and secure characterization of just what the fundamental physical properties actually are. Okay, that's a problem, right? Like, what the hell are we actually supposed to reduce consciousness, for instance, to? What the hell are we supposed to reduce moral values to? Siegfried Jag and Christian Lowe, I'm probably pronouncing their names incorrectly, but they have this article called Why Defend Humean Supervenience? And they suggest that we should take the Humean mosaic as a kind of idealization. Idealization is common in science. So, for instance, it's often the case that, we might, for instance, model a star as if the star were composed of an ideal gas. So if you want to understand, like, the behavior of a star, well, you just assume that the star is composed of an ideal gas, even though we know that nothing is an ideal gas. We know that actually, it's not that the star really is composed of point particles that have no intermolecular friction, etc. Right? But it just sort of simplifies things to model the star as if it were composed of an ideal gas. Or consider modelling a population of organisms as if the population contained an infinite number of members, right? Or think about, frictionless planes and things like that, right? In science, scientists will often appeal to these idealizations in order to simplify and you know well, yeah, I mean, like, simplify a very complex world. If we want to explain and understand things, we often have to simplify and abstract. So so the thought is that, the Humean Mosaic is an idealization. So what exactly is its goal? What's the point of this idealization? Well, the goal is to establish the tenability of physicalism, and it can do this by giving us an understanding of the higher level structures of the world. It can give us an understanding of, how it is that, there are things like ordinary objects, how it is that there are laws, how it is that there are things like moral values and consciousness and so on. The precise details of what's happening at the fundamental physical level are not going to be so important in this context. What's important is just, as Jagan Low put it, commonsensical higher-level features of the world, such as colours, mentality and values, can be accounted for in terms of such a sparse fundamental structure. So by showing that the Humean Mosaic is enough to capture all these phenomena, we protect physicalism from the philosophical objections. Daniel Nolan gives the following analogy. Suppose that a bridge collapses and we ask, why did the bridge collapse? Well, we're probably going to give an explanation in terms of Newtonian mechanics, right? We're going to work out the stresses on the bridge that are caused by mechanical action and gravity. Now, we know that Newtonian mechanics is not, strictly speaking, true. In fact, not just strictly speaking, right? Newtonian mechanics is way off in terms of its description of the underlying structure of the world. Like, in terms of what Newtonian mechanics says about, like, mass and space-time and gravity and all of that stuff, like, in terms of its description of what's happening on the sort of fundamental level, we'd say, it's false, right? It gets things wrong. Nevertheless, when it comes to explaining the collapse of the bridge, well, the Newtonian explanation of the bridge collapse is true enough. It gives us the right kind of results in that context. And even if we knew the perfectly correct fundamental physical theory, that wouldn't really make much difference to our explanation of why the bridge collapsed. Like, ultimately, we do have we have the better theories already, right? Like, we have general relativity, we have quantum mechanics, but still, when we want to explain why a bridge collapsed, we don't use general relativity to do it. We use Newtonian mechanics. So this is an idealization, but it's an idealization that gives us a very deep understanding of of lots of stuff in the world. So similarly then, philosophers, they ask questions like, what is consciousness? What is moral value? What is a law of nature? What is causality? And Lewis argues that in none of these cases do we have a genuine challenge to reductionist physicalism. We don't need to postulate anything more to account for these things than what we find in current physics or what we will find in future physics. Even if Humean supervenience isn't quite right, it's sufficient to dislodge the philosophical objections to this kind of reductionist physicalist explanation. And I mean, really, we don't, like, what alternative do we have? We don't actually know what the exact content of the final correct physics will be, so we have no choice but to idealize here. So if Lewis is successful at reducing such things to the Humean mosaic, then he shows that all we need is that there are particles with intrinsic properties and spatiotemporal relations. And that's close enough to what we find in contemporary physics, right? Because in contemporary physics, there are still particles with properties such as charge and mass, plus spatiotemporal relations between these particles. These particles compose atoms, which compose molecules, which compose various higher level structures. Contemporary physics doesn't really challenge that picture, and it's a good bet that future physics won't challenge it either. Of course, we've filled in the details of this picture in ways that are perhaps surprising. Maybe there are going to be more surprises in the future, but the point is, probably, things like atoms and molecules, they're probably here to stay. They're not going to get eliminated in the future. Our understanding of them might change a little bit, but they're probably here to stay. It's probably always going to be the case that, this table, for instance, is composed of molecules, and that the sorts of properties that we attribute to molecules, like, you know, mass and so on, we're going to carry on attributing those properties to those molecules. So if it turns out that there are more fundamental properties and relations beyond the properties distributed in space-time, if it turns out that there are entanglement relations, say, that's not really going to make much difference. Because if we can reduce the relevant phenomena to local properties distributed in space-time, that general reductionist picture is not going to be threatened if it turns out that physics contains more than this. Indeed, that would, if anything, only make physicalist reductionism more plausible, right? It would give the reductionist more to work with. Similarly, suppose we claim that mental states are reducible to brain states, and we think of brain states in terms of just neurons. So we're basically saying, look, we can explain everything about consciousness just by appealing to the activity of neurons. Well, it would hardly be a problem for that view if it turns out that brains contain more than neurons. So if it turns out brains contain neurons plus other stuff. Well, actually, that's a good thing. If you're claiming that mental states are reducible to brain states, then if you've got neurons plus other stuff, you have even more to work with. So if you can show that, you know, that mental states reduce to the activity of neurons, you've surely shown that mental states can be reduced to brain activity, at least in principle. Or if let's say, for instance, the local properties distributed in space-time are reduced to something else. Let's say, for instance, that space-time turns out to be emergent. Well, again, that's not really much of a challenge. Similarly, it wouldn't be an objection to, you know, an account which reduces mental states to brain states, that brain states are themselves reducible to something else. Indeed, that's what everybody already thinks. You know, when physicalists try to defend materialism about the mind, they frame it in terms of brain states, right? You know, they'll say, right, you know, we can account for what's going on in the mind by looking at what's going on, you know, in the brain, and it's not a challenge to that to then say, well, it turns out that brain states are emergent from the, you know, that brain states reduced to the activity of you know, molecules and particles and all of that. Reductionists often don't need to reduce all the way down to the fundamental level. So as long as there is space-time, and as long as all of the higher level phenomena can be reduced to what's going on in space-time, like, I mean, this is the point, right? So we have things like minds and values and causality and laws and all this. As long as we can reduce all of that stuff to what's going on in space-time, it doesn't really matter if physics reveals that space-time is actually emergent from something else. So, I mean, Lewis, you know, he has sort of two broad goals here. I mean, first of all, he wants to show that fundamental physics gives us, in some sense, a complete ontology of the world. There's nothing more to the world than what is or what will be postulated in physics. And then second, he wants to show that our common sense beliefs about the world are nevertheless mostly true. So there are ordinary objects, there are mental states and moral values and laws of nature and causality and all of that. And these things have pretty much the features that we ordinarily take them to have. Now, by showing that a foundation as sparse as the Humean Mosaic is enough to vindicate these common sense beliefs, we have really taken the wind out of the sails of the anti-reductionists. I mean, if the Humean Mosaic can do it, almost certainly future physics will be able to do it too. Because, you know, all we need is properties like mass and charge and space-time, and future physics is probably not going to completely eliminate those. Maybe it'll give us more to work with, but, you know. So yes, the Humean Mosaic may, strictly speaking, be false, but it may still be apt as an account of the world's higher level structure. In the same way, a Newtonian model is, strictly speaking, false, but it can still be apt as an account of why the bridge collapsed. This is, well, this is at least how Jag and Lowe think of the Humean Mosaic, think of Humean supervenience. This also perhaps helps to address one of the central challenges to physicalism, which is Hempel's dilemma. So essentially the problem is this. What exactly is a physical property? If we specify what counts as a physical property by reference to past physics and current physics, so maybe we say that, you know, the physical is just whatever has been postulated by physics, you know, in the past and currently, well then physicalism is just straightforwardly false, because we think that current physics will change in the future. Future physics is probably going to postulate things that we haven't thought of yet. So So then, if you claim everything is physical, and what you mean by physical is whatever's postulated by current physics, well, no, that's actually not true. No, not everything is physical. On the other hand, if we say that the physical is whatever is postulated by future physics, whatever will be postulated by future physics, then physicalism just seems completely empty, because, I mean, we can't say right now what's going to be postulated in future physics. For more on this type of issue, I have a video called What is a Physical Property, so you can check that out for more on that. But the Humean Mosaic, I mean, the Humean Mosaic is a model which it tells us exactly what the physical properties are. Now, of course, we think that this particular model is not true. So, these intrinsic properties at space-time points, right? Okay, maybe that's not how the world actually works. But the key thing is, surely if anything counts as a physical property, then properties like mass and charge instantiated at space-time points will count, right? So the properties that are used in the Humean Mosaic are prototypical physical properties. They are paradigmatic physical properties. If anything is a physical property, those are physical properties. So if we can show how everything supervenes on the Humean Mosaic, we have shown the tenability of physicalism. And that's the case regardless of how these debates about how exactly to define physical property end up being resolved. We have disposed with the philosophical challenges to physicalism, even if our understanding of actual physics changes. I mean, maybe consider it this way. Consider how our view of the world might change in the future. Suppose it turns out that the panpsychists are right, okay? And panpsychists claim that phenomenal properties are fundamental properties along with charge or mass. So for a panpsychist, there is some sense in which everything possesses consciousness. Mind or mind-like properties are universal. Now, this is often viewed as a competitor to physicalism. So we might say, well, if panpsychism were shown to be true, then physicalism would be refuted. Or we might say, as some philosophers do, people like Galen Strawson, that actually, if panpsychism were shown to be true, well, what this would show is just that fundamental phenomenal properties are physical. Why not? Why shouldn't they be, actually? But, one message, I suppose, of the Humean Mosaic is that, the reductive physicalist can kind of let the chips fall where they may in terms of the question of whether these properties are physical, because regardless of how this question is decided, regardless of whether we think that fundamental phenomenal properties could be physical or not, the point is that bog standard physical properties like charge and mass, the properties that everybody agrees are physical properties, those properties are themselves enough to explain, for instance, consciousness. So even if we did want to say that maybe phenomenal properties, maybe these fundamental, irreducible phenomenal properties could be physical properties, even if we say something like that, there isn't really a challenge to the sort of reductionist picture that Lewis is trying to defend. Because he's to say, well, no, right, the paradigmatically, prototypically physical properties are actually enough to explain consciousness. Or suppose that, okay, why is there, I should have another slide there, but it's not coming up. I guess I could edit that. Screw it, we're right at the end anyway. Okay, so, or suppose that fundamental physics does end up postulating necessary connections, fundamental necessary connections. Again, what do you say about these fundamental necessary connections? Are they physical properties or not? The interesting thing about Humean supervenience is, well, look, we don't need necessary connections in order to account for our common sense judgments about laws of nature and causality and so on. As Jag and Low put it, since the aptness of the Humean model shows that our common sense beliefs are true regardless of whether the world has any modal structure, it thereby shows that it does not matter for the truth of reductive physicalism how this debate is resolved. So again, we can kind of just let the chips fall where they may. If physics ends up postulating this, fundamental modal structure, then great. But if not, it doesn't really matter. You know, it'll still be the case that, you know, there are laws of nature and that there's causality and all of that, and that all of that reduces to what's being said in fundamental physics, right? So physics is enough to give us a complete account of the world, regardless. That is Humean supervenience. That is the Humean mosaic. Now, obviously, it would be nice to have. I mean, I've talked a lot here about you know, reducing various properties to the Humean mosaic, and of course, it would be nice to have a specific example of what that might actually look like. And I'm going to do that in another video. I'm going to, if I get around to it, I'll examine Lewis's account of laws of nature in more detail, and so we'll be able to see Humean supervenience in action. But that's a task for another video. That's it for today. So thank you for watching, and I'll say bye for now.